We'd like you to know that there are panels today at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the Bonner Room over in the sub, and we'll have a number of the historical figures you'll be hearing from today, including Thomas Jefferson. So if you can make either of those, again, that's 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock. Last night I had the pleasure of dining with Dr. Clay Jenkinson. Dr. Jenkinson is a Rhodes Scholar. He studied Renaissance English literature and theology. He's a founder of the modern-day Chautauqua movement, and he's the father of a 2.5-year-old daughter. This morning, however, I'm here to introduce one of the founders of our nation and our form of government. A man accomplished in literature, law, science, music, languages, architecture, philosophy, mathematics, even enology, which has to do with winemaking, if you didn't recognize that one. A lawyer, a Virginia planter, an author and architect, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and the governor of Virginia, the first Secretary of State under President George Washington, Vice President under John Adams, Minister to France, where he gave King Louis some good advice about guaranteeing individual rights and liberties to the citizens of France. King Louis, to his regret, did not take that advice. An exhaustive intellect who wrote on everything from whale fishing to the flora and fauna of Virginia to the history of weights and measures. Nothing escaped his attention and his interest. To give you some idea of his range of activities and interests, in 1 week, Thomas Jefferson was installed as the president of the American Philosophical Society. The next day, he was sworn in as vice president. And a week later, he presented a paper to the Philosophical Society on megalonyx, a recent fossil discovery in Virginia. He gave us the Declaration of Independence, the Lewis and Clark expedition, Louisiana Purchase, and a standard of civic involvement unmatched to this day. While I could wish, as a woman, that he had given us our rightful place in his concern for freedom, he did propose education for both male and female in Virginia, and his draft constitution for Virginia did provide equal rights for women, at least in determining inheritance. President for 2 terms, Thomas Jefferson would have us remember him as author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Let us honor Mr. Jefferson.
My dear citizens, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me into the American West. I purchased much of the West from Bonaparte in the year 1803, and I sent my beloved young friend Meriwether Lewis here in 1804. But unfortunately, I never traveled farther than 50 miles west of my birthplace in Virginia. I always wanted to see the West, particularly after Mr. Lewis brought back his remarkable journals, the Great Falls of the Missouri, the Bitterroot Mountains, the Columbia Estuary, the bison that he saw literally in herds of tens and hundreds of thousands. And I cannot come to Idaho in your time without thinking of Mr. Lewis in the spring of 1806. This would have been during my second term as president. He had been gone now for 2 years. He had wintered at a little crude hut called Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon. That had been an extremely disagreeable winter for Mr. Lewis and his 40-some companions, including one woman and a child. And he had wanted very much to come back to the United States sooner rather than later. And he knew that if he didn't get over these Bitterroot Mountains early in the summer, he might not get as far as St. Louis by the winter's freeze. So he pushed his expedition rather too quickly up the Columbia. And not so far from this room, he became embarrassed, enmeshed in the winter snows, which were unusually deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. Now he had the choice of either turning back to the Pacific Ocean abandoning the expedition altogether, trying to push through the winter storms, or finding some hospitality at the bottom of the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. And he spent more than a month with the ingenious Nez Perce Indians, who in some regards must be said to have saved the expedition, once on the way west and once on the way east. What an extraordinary adventure for Mr. Lewis. He met 178 plant species that had never been cataloged before. He saw 122 animal species that had never been described by Enlightenment science, including the bighorn sheep and the coyote and the jackrabbit. But most interestingly for me, in the course of his 2.5-year expedition, he met 50 separate sovereign Indian peoples, including the Nez Perce, and 24 of them were entirely new to civilization. He returned to St. Louis on the 23rd of September, 1806. He held up the mails to write me a letter in which he said, "Extraordinary though the West is, I must tell you, Mr. President, that the ancient dream of a Northwest passage by water from the Mississippi system into the Columbia system does not exist. That what we hoped would be a small portage between navigable waters of the two river systems, in fact, was more than 340 miles in distance." And so an ancient human dream ended in September of 1806. Mr. Lewis came back to Washington City, where he was treated like a conquering hero. I appointed him to become the first governor of northern Louisiana in St. Louis. And the sad conclusion, which some of you perhaps know, is that Mr. Lewis committed suicide just 3 years after his tour, having never written a single page of his narrative. So the Lewis and Clark expedition lost some of its luster over that, and I lost one of my closest friends. But most importantly, science lost extremely important data that wasn't published for decades, and most of Mr. Lewis's discoveries in the West had to be rediscovered, often by lesser men. So I wanted to start by paying that tribute to my young friend. He lived with me for almost 2 years in the White House before he went west. We lived there alone, along with some servants. My wife had been dead since 1782. My daughters were busy with their young families in Virginia. I was a widower president, and Mr. Lewis and I lived practically alone in that great castle of a building. I said, "We are as lonely as two church mice here." And I spent that 2-year period teaching him the art of celestial navigation, the art of classification of plants and animals. And particularly, I told him about my plan for a kind of Pax Americana, a grand peace policy in the American West, in which tribes would cease to war against each other as they had for centuries. And under the umbrella of American military security, they would be allowed to make the transition from tribalism towards sedentary agriculture. But enough of that for the moment. Let me also say that I come with great hesitation because I am not an accomplished orator. The great orators of my time were Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. I was a poor orator, and I never gave speeches of the kind that I have been asked to give this morning. In fact, when I agreed to stand for the presidency in the year 1800, something I did reluctantly, I told my friend Mr. Madison, "I will stand for this office on the condition that I need make no public appearances whatsoever." And I didn't. I spent the entire campaign at Monticello gardening. I narrowly defeated my friend John Adams to become the third president. I gave an inaugural address that was so poorly articulated, so mumbled, that no one in the Senate chamber of our new national capital heard my vision of America, and thereafter I dispensed with speeches altogether. Today I'm going to do something that I never did in the whole course of my life. I'm going to conduct a presidential news conference. And I'm going to begin immediately because I know you have questions. And so for the next hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to take as many questions as I possibly can on any subject whatsoever. All I ask is if you are in the back that you stand up and speak as clearly as you can, and I'll try to keep the pace moving. You can ask questions from your time or from mine. You can ask personal or public questions. You can ask polite questions or the reverse. Who should like to begin? Yes, please.
Okay, why do they call this a popcorn forum if there's no popcorn?
This is a great question. I am America's foremost advocate of protest and rebellion, and we have one immediately. This young lady says, if this is a popcorn forum, bring on the popcorn. Now see, this is a key moment in America. Because if Alexander Hamilton were here, he would have you taken out of this auditorium and probably jailed for sedition. Because there are men, and I'm serious, like Hamilton and even George Washington, who cannot accept the fact that the people are a yeasty and sometimes troublesome bunch. And they will, whether you like it or not, rise up in protest from time to time. When Shays' Rebellion began in western Massachusetts in 1786, I was asked to condemn Shays' Rebellion, and I refused to do so. I said, I like a little rebellion now and then. It's as important in the political world as thunderstorms are in the natural world. Now you have two choices. Either you can rush Tony Stewart and force him to make you popcorn, or you can listen to what we have to say and demand it later. But I assure you that if popcorn is what you desire, it can be furnished. Other questions? Yes.
You said that you reluctantly accepted the presidency.
Yes.
It was my impression that you campaigned for that job for 3 years ahead of time.
The question is, how reluctant was I about the presidency? Well, this gentleman is clearly some sort of Hamiltonian or Federalist. I truly did not want to be the President of the United States. I called that office splendid misery. And when I left office voluntarily after 2 terms on the 4th of March, 1809, I wrote a letter on the eve of my departure from Washington to my old friend DuPont, in which I said honestly, nature fitted me to be a scientist by rendering that my supreme delight. Only the emergencies of the times in which we have lived have turned me from my passion, which is agriculture and science, to the disagreeable burden of politics. I said, I have no more desire to govern men than to ride my horse through a blizzard. So it's not true that I wanted the presidency, but I'll say this. I wanted someone of my political persuasion to be president in 1800, because the first 2 presidents, friends of mine, General Washington and John Adams, good men, even great men, did not have enough respect for the people. And they were defining our new republic in a kind of centralized fashion with an executive somewhat like a European monarch. They had a certain contempt for the people, and Alexander Hamilton was more contemptuous even than they. And I realized around 1796 or 97 that if my party, what became known as the Republican Party, did not oppose federalism, this nation might become just another European-style, centralized, class-ridden, economically troubled society. And I couldn't stand to see that. I believe we can have something like a utopia here in America. So I wanted Mr. Madison to stand for the presidency, but he wouldn't. And he and others pressed me forward. And I admitted, I will only admit this in retrospect, but it is the truth, that of all of the men of my political persuasion, I was the one who commanded the greatest respect across the nation. So it was in some ways logical that I be the candidate for the presidency. But I assure you, if anyone else would have done it, I would have yielded. And I promise you, others would have done it better. Yes?
How old were you when you died?
How old was I when I died? I was 83 years old, and I died of prostate cancer. Yes, over here.
What would you consider the highlight of your presidency?
The highlight of my presidency. Well, The easy answer to that is the Louisiana Purchase. When I became president, I inherited a problem because the Mississippi River is an extremely important economic artery, and whichever nation controls the port of New Orleans controls the entire destiny of the United States. And for decades, the lower Mississippi had been held by Spain, which was a declining power. But suddenly, in a secret treaty in 1800, Spain had retroceded the territory to Napoleon Bonaparte. And suddenly, the world's most ambitious expansionist power controlled the lower Mississippi. This frightened me deeply. So I sent ministers to Paris in 1803 to purchase New Orleans, purchase the city of New Orleans or a territory around it so the lower Mississippi could be kept open. Napoleon was bankrupt and desperate to prosecute his wars in Europe, so he agreed to give us New Orleans if and only if we would also accept the entire district of Louisiana, a territory of unknown dimensions. But we knew immediately that it doubled the size of the United States with a single stroke of the pen. So suddenly I had wanted a tiny little village in the lower Mississippi, and I bought empire instead. This was an act of great luck. I called it a fugitive occurrence. But surely it was the making moment of American history, and because it happened during my presidency, I must take some credit for it. But I honestly believe it would have occurred no matter who was president. Let me give you a better example for me. In 1802, the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote me a letter of congratulations because they knew that I believed that we must have a separation of church and state. And they did not approve of what they took to be my own religious sensibilities, but they approved of my tolerance, my belief that all religions are equally valid. And I responded to their letter with one of the most important documents in American history. And I said to them, my reading of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is that it erects a wall of separation between church and state. And that phrase, wall of separation between church and state, even though it was not part of the Constitution of the United States, has worked its way into being one of the fundamental principles of this society. And if you can believe that this society could ever have flourished without that principle, you have not studied history. Yes, back here in the cap. The question is, given my own views from my own time, what would my response have been to nuclear and chemical weapons in your time? Well, first of all, let me say that my favorite principle is that the earth belongs to the living and not the dead. The dead have no right to impose their will on the future. So I feel some reluctance in answering a question that calls for me to sort out problems in your own time, but I will show you what I would have thought in mine. When I was in Europe, I wrote a model treaty. I was the ambassador to France between 1784 and 1789. And I wrote a model treaty, and one of its provisions was to prevent war from devastating civilian populations. I proposed that war, if we must have it, be engaged by combatants, voluntary combatants of both societies, under carefully controlled principles of engagement, and that farmers and sailors and other key members of the economy be exempted from war service so that the great good of society can continue, and indeed that members of the Republic of Letters, intellectuals, scientists, poets, be exempted from war so that the real work of civilization can always carry on. And then under no circumstance would that war be carried to non-combatants. Well, I think you can see, given that principle, which was accepted by Prussia in my time, but by no other nation, that I could not have approved of weapons in your time which are designed to kill civilians, whose very purpose is terror rather than competition between designated armies. Yes? How are states named? Good question. Very good question. I named a bunch in the Ohio Valley, but most of them were not accepted. The American West was a blank slate, a kind of tabula rasa, and we had to decide how the western states would be admitted and under what circumstances. I was a congressman in 1784 in Philadelphia, and I wrote something called the Plan for the Government of the Western Territories. And this was a way of bringing in western states like Kentucky and Ohio and eventually Idaho on an equal basis without colonizing them. It's a very difficult problem. How do we avoid colonizing our interior as Britain has previously colonized us? Well, I provided some solutions to that problem in this Bill for the Government of the Western Territories of 1784, which became, by the way, the basis for the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. But I also wanted the western states to be small. For this reason, a French philosopher named Montesquieu argued in a famous book that a republic, a self-governing, limited society, can only cohere, can only work if it's a small geography. And he really believed that a republic of about the size of Rhode Island or Delaware was as large as any should ever be. So I wanted small western states so that at least they would be Montesquieuian in some fashion or other. The largest western state under my proposal would have been about the size of Iowa. They all would have been perfectly square and the size of Iowa. And so I laid out 14 in the Ohio Valley, and I thought I may as well give them names too. So I consulted Greek and Latin and Indian languages, and I called one Polypotamia, place of many waters, another Metropotamia, another Chersonesus, Michigania, Sylvania. But George Washington was rather more conservative than I was, and he refused those names. But if I had had my way, there would be 64 states west of the Mississippi River, all perfectly square. How can you ever have let Idaho be so irrational in its shape? This really troubles my rationalist mind. Yes, in the back, sir.
Why do you claim sole responsibility for drafting the Declaration of Independence, even on your tombstone?
Are you wishing to challenge that?
Benjamin Franklin overdo the entire draft of the Declaration of Independence. Did you have help from the whole committee? Was it not just you? I mean, how do you claim responsibility?
The question is, why do I claim virtually sole responsibility for the Declaration of Independence? I mean, the simple answer is because it's the truth, but I will explain it for you. I was the youngest member of a committee at the Continental Congress, which was asked in the spring of 1776 to prepare a document to declare our independency from Great Britain. The other two primary members were Dr. Franklin, as you rightly say, the greatest American, and my friend John Adams. There were two other members, but they dropped out rather early. Dr. Franklin did not wish to write the Declaration of Independence because he was an elderly statesman. He felt in some sense that he was beyond that sort of draftsmanship. John Adams came to me at my boarding house. I was staying in a boarding room in Philadelphia. He came to me one day and he said, "Mr. Jefferson, you must write this document." He was 8 years older than I was, and he was much more important in the revolutionary buildup than I had been. And I said, "No, I defer to you, sir." He said, "No, you must write it for 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian must be at the head of this business. Second, I, John Adams, am disliked and obnoxious. And if I write this document, it will lack credibility. And third," he said, "you write 10 times better than I do." Well, eventually I agreed to try. So for 17 days between the 11th of June and the 28th of June, 1776, I sat alone in a room with a sheet of paper in front of me and nothing else. No books, no pamphlets, no research materials. And on this blank sheet of paper, I invented America. Now, I had read 10, 12, 13, 15 hours a day all of my life. I was one of the most indefatigable readers who ever lived. I had distilled the entire Enlightenment tradition into my own commonplace books and my own thinking. So when this moment came, I was fully prepared. I knew John Locke. I knew Montesquieu, I knew Polybius, I knew Rousseau, I knew Voltaire, I knew George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, I knew the Scottish Enlightenment. And so on this blank sheet of paper, I simply wrote out the common sense of the subject, what any one of you would have written had you been called upon to take this task. And when I had finished it, with no consultation with anyone else, I took it to Dr. Franklin. And Dr. Franklin read it through and suggested one extremely important change. I had said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin, the mathematician, said, "No, we hold these truths to be self-evident." In other words, like a principle of geometry, every rational person will accept this proposition. And indeed, he improved my document with that change. John Adams suggested some minor points of punctuation and so on, but he agreed to champion the document in Congress. So I leave it to you to decide whether one or two verbal suggestions by my colleagues amount to co-authorship. Then I submitted it to the Congress of the United States. As a gentleman, I could not argue for my own draft or defend it even. John Adams did that. And then Congress, in its 2.5 day debate, reduced the size of the Declaration of Independence by fully 1/4, taking out some things that really mattered to me, including a strong denunciation of the slave trade. And then Congress passed it on the 4th of July, 1776. It really bothered me to sit in that room and listen to the wits of Congress edit my work. And I was frankly offended by the omissions. And for the rest of my life, I had my own version printed up, and I gave it to my friends and insisted that they prefer it to the one that had been promulgated. So I leave it to the audience to decide which of us has told the truth. Yes, sir, in the back. Yes. How much education? Well, I was privately educated. There were no public schools in my time. I was privately educated until the age of 16 and a half when I went up to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. I spent 2.5 years there studying with a minor member of the British Enlightenment, a man named William Small, a man who was my first mentor and who set the destinies of my life. Then for 5 years I was the law student of the greatest legal mind in America, a man named George Wythe. This was a time before law schools, and that was the end of my formal education at about the age of 23 or 4. But I don't believe education stops when we take on a profession. I continued to read 5, 6, 10 hours a day for the rest of my life. I eventually accumulated a library of 7,000 volumes. I played several musical instruments, including the cello and violin, and I knew 7 languages, 3 ancient and 4 modern. So my formal education was rather limited, but my self-education never ended at all. Sir, you were about to say.
Could you elaborate more on your views on Native peoples of this land?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I wrote in my second, this is about American Indians, Native peoples, I'm sorry. In my second inaugural address in 1805, I addressed this subject in terms of policy. And this is what I said. I invite you to look at the full draft. But I said, these people deserve our commiseration. They only wanted to be left undisturbed. I think we must never forget that these people wanted to be left undisturbed. We came, we brought a European technology, European property concepts, European diseases with us, and we simply overwhelmed the native peoples. Their methods of warfare could not compete with ours. Their immune systems could not compete with ours. Their material culture could not compete with the wonders of metallurgy. And so suddenly, the world's most advanced industrial civilization encounters a Stone Age people. It's not at all surprising, therefore, that it was an unequal contest. So our duty is restraint. We mustn't simply let this differential of cultural capacities overwhelm the natives. On the other hand, it's our duty as a social contract to enable this continent to support liberty. This is an extremely difficult balance to strike. My policy as president was to encourage the tribes of the Ohio Valley, the Near West, to sell their lands to us, the government, not to speculators, not to states, but to the United States, for just compensation and voluntarily, and to remove themselves voluntarily out into the far west, into Montana, Dakota. This, I thought, would buy them some breathing space. And we would give them the best of our civilization, the alphabet, the wheel, metallurgy, a few other inventions. They would then cease to be nomadic and cease to be warlike, would take up the plow, and would accelerate their cultural pace. We, for our part, would decelerate our cultural advancement and retard ourselves as long as possible in an agrarian economy. We would then people the West compactly, tier after tier in Western states, rather than spasmodically. And by the time we finally reached the Missouri River after 900 or 1,000 years, we would meet the native peoples like equals. We would intermingle and even intermarry at that point to produce an amalgamated American race, partly Indian and partly European. That was my policy. This young lady here in the blue. What was my childhood like? It was idyllic until I was 14. It was wonderful. I grew up with privileges. I lived on a plantation. My father was interested in the American West. Indian peoples came to stay with us, and I gained my lifelong respect for Indians when they stood in our living room. It was a wonderful childhood in many respects, but then two things. My father died when I was 14, and that was a terrible blow to me from which I never really fully recovered. And secondly, I wrote this in my book Notes on the State of Virginia. You grow up, and then you begin at some point to look around you and to see what your world is. And my first memory of all of the thousands and thousands of memories in my life was of being 2 years old. My father moved our house about 70 miles. And my first memory is of being carried at the age of 2 on a velvet pillow by a black slave on top of a horse for that journey. And for the rest of my life, slavery was inextricably interwoven into my existence. I abhor slavery. Slavery is unnatural, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's a violation of every concept that I stand for. And yet I was born into it, and as you all, I think, know, was never able fully to extract myself from this outrageous system. And I said in my book Notes on Virginia that children are an imitative animal. I said the parent storms in anger or wrath at slaves. The child looks on and learns to imitate this practice. So one of the worst things about slavery, aside from what it does to black slaves, is what it does to white slaveholders. It degrades us morally. I said the man must be a prodigy whose manners and morals can survive undepraved by such circumstances. So yes, idyllic, but two severe blows. In the back, this woman, yes, please. I'm sorry? Yes, I just said that I was born into slavery and I owned as many as 200 slaves in the course of my life. Yes, I did write an attack on the slave trade and on slavery in the Declaration of Independence. That paragraph was expunged at the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia, so it didn't survive to the end, which really troubled me. And then I wrote about between 10 and 12 pieces of legislation over the next 15 years that would have enabled us to free all of the slaves or free them on a plantation-by-plantation basis, either immediately or within a generation or two. And every one of those proposals was overwhelmingly defeated. I never freed more than 8 of my own slaves out of the 200 or so that I owned, because I honestly believed that in a world where they had no rights, no jobs, no housing, no transition from total dependency into independency, that it was actually a disservice to them as human beings to free them into that sort of a world. I'm sorry? Well, somebody has to be the judge of it, and I was born into a system which I tried very hard to make the best of and to change. We may disagree about it. I hope we disagree as rational friends. Yes, madam. What was my religious background? Well, I am so reluctant to talk about this because it's none of your business. And I don't mean any disrespect by that, but You see, I'm a public figure, so if I tell you that I'm a Baptist, that may suggest that you ought to be a Baptist, or you may be offended because you're a Quaker. So I always avoided talking about it. I said, say nothing of my religion. And I was pressed again and again. I was called an atheist in the election of 1800, and I was called a free thinker. And wild rumors spread about my religious sensibilities. And because I maintained this silence, it allowed my enemies to speculate irresponsibly about me. I am not an atheist, I'm a deist. A deist is one who believes that the universe is so beautiful and orderly, so perfect in its mechanics, that there must have been a designer. Where there was a fabric, there must have been a fabricator. Where there was a creation, there must have been a creator. So my God, if you want to call it that, is a deistic God, a kind of celestial mechanic who has produced a perfect clock-like universe and wound it up, and now stands serenely by while that clock slowly unwinds through the course of history. But this God, in my private opinion, is not the God of the Old and New Testaments. He did not plant his seed in the womb of a virgin. He does not suspend the Newtonian laws of the universe at will. He does not raise us from the dead on the third day. And Jesus, the greatest man who ever lived, was not the Son of God. He was an ethicist of the highest moral capacity. When I was pressed on this subject, I said sometimes, all right, I'm an apiarian. Like a bee, I flit from one religion and suck out all the honey of each. Late in life, I said I hoped within 50 years every young American would be a Unitarian. I must say I'm no friend to organized religion. I helped to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia. I stand for separation of church and state. And I said this of preachers. I said, let's gather all of the evangelical and charismatic religious teachers of the United States into one public square for a week of debate about liturgy and hermeneutics and doctrine and the Bible, in the hopes that they will mutually exhaust each other and disappear forever. Yes, go ahead, sir.
I understand that throughout your life you had to sell most of the land that you inherited from your father in order to pay your debts, which were extensive. Could you comment on your apparent lack of success in personal financial matters?
The question is, why did I die bankrupt? Well, there are lots of answers to this question. I spent 5 decades in public life, and you cannot manage a successful estate while you are absent. Secondly, because we were a new experimental republic, we underpaid all of our public officials to show that we weren't going to create careerism of the sort that had bedeviled Europe. Third, it cost me more in each of my public offices, ambassador to France, vice president, president. It cost me more than my salary could possibly provide. I went in debt in each of those public offices. So those are significant reasons. Furthermore, there were wild dislocations of the plantation economy owing to the war and the inflation and deflation cycles that followed it. And most planters never recovered from that indebtedness. If you were deep in debt when the war came in 1776, you probably never extricated yourself. So that's one reason why I died $107,000 in debt. Here are 2 more. First, I was extravagant. I bought all of the books I wanted, all of the scientific instruments, and I bought all of the finest wines in the world. And if you buy all the things that you really want in life, you will always be in debt. I was one of the most organized people who ever lived. I had 5 daily diaries, a weather book, a letter log, a farm book, a garden book, and an account book. 5 separate physical diaries that I carried with me at all times and jotted almost everything down in, including every penny, literally, that I spent from the 4th of July, 1776 until my death on the 4th of July, 1826. Every expenditure without a single omission. Unfortunately, I never added up the sums. Madam, you've been waiting, yes? Did I have a sexual liaison with my slave, Sally Hemings? Again, none of your business. Yes, ma'am. Yes, you.
What would you think about the current level of lobbyists and their effect on government today? And how would you align with past
woman has answered her own question. What is my view of the use of lobbyists and political action committees in the political process in your time? And the answer, of course, is that when Mr. Hamilton's moneyed and privileged people begin to influence public life, it will destroy the republic. Let me give you an example from my own time. We had a national debt of about $80 million that had been accumulated during the war. When the new government took office after the Constitution of 1787, Alexander Hamilton was named first Secretary of Treasury. I was first Secretary of State. We had to wrestle with this giant debt that we suddenly had accumulated for our liberty, and Mr. Hamilton rightly decided that we should pay off the debt at par. These war bonds had been purchased by mechanics and farmers and widows and soldiers, and because of the depreciation of our national currency, they had been reduced to 20 cents of their original value, sometimes 15, sometimes 5 cents. So they were basically worthless, and many people felt they would never be redeemed. Well, Mr. Hamilton rightly believed we would never be a great nation until we redeemed the debt at par, at 100%. All of which I agreed with. But here's where the moneyed interests corrupt a society. Mr. Hamilton decided to announce this principle, paying the debt at 100%. But before he did so, a month before he did so, he told his closest friends, and they went out and literally bought up hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars of war bonds for 10 cents on the dollar and 2 cents on the dollar from widows, from crippled veterans, from farmers who had made our revolution successful. And then after they had had their chance for corrupt speculation, then and only then he announced as a government policy that we would pay the debt at par. And when he was challenged about this, he did not blush. He said, no. If we attach the rich and the well-born to the success of our republic, there is no limit to what we might do as a nation. In other words, Mr. Hamilton believed that the republic existed for its privileged classes and not for everyone. And that, of course, continues to bedevil your time. Yes, sir.
Would you explain the Jefferson Bible?
The Jefferson Bible, well, I'm reluctant to go too much farther on this religious theme, lest I offend someone. But let me just say this. When I was President of the United States, I received a letter from Dr. Joseph Priestley, the father of the Unitarian Church. I had given him asylum in the United States. He, by the way, was the discoverer of oxygen in Britain. And he wrote to me. We were fond of writing to each other on religious questions. He wrote to me and he said, my friend, if you disagree with so much that is in the Bible, why not simply edit that text? Well, you know, this had never occurred to me. But we had edited Cicero, we had edited Tacitus, we had edited Thucydides and Homer. Why not edit the Bible too? So I did it. The presidency was not particularly burdensome. So for about 6 nights, I took a copy of the Bible and I cut out everything that was irrational, mystical, miraculous, obscure, or out of keeping with human reason and dignity. And that produced what in your time is still in print, the Jefferson Bible. It's a pamphlet of 42 pages. It contains none of the Old Testament, of course. Of the New Testament, it contains a brief biographical sketch of Jesus, the greatest man who ever lived. No miracles, no healings, no resurrection, no apocalyptic talk, no atonement, no original sin, but a life of Jesus from the Synoptic Gospels, chiefly Matthew, and then of his sayings, the more clear-headed of them. Now, I mean no disrespect by this. I believe honestly that Jesus was the greatest human being who ever lived on earth and that his ethics was pure but fragmentary. And because he didn't write his own views down himself, we have to depend upon his apostles and others, some of whom were illiterate and others of whom were self-interested. And over the course of time, the pure ethics of Jesus have been encrusted with interpolations and with mistranslations and so on. And without any disrespect, I mean honestly, that it's as easy for us to find the pure sayings of Jesus in the New Testament as it is to find diamonds in a dunghill. And that's what I did. Now, I was no fool. I did not publish this book. But it was published long after my time by none other than the Congress of the United States. And if you go to your local bookstore, that store will either have it or can order it for you. I urge you to take a look at it. it ends with the rock being rolled up to the tomb, which I think you will agree is a very good place for a rationalist's Bible to end. There's only one lapse in the book, and I'm going to tell you because it shows that the heart will sometimes overwhelm the head. I had 6 children. 4 of them died before they were 5. They died of infant diseases like teething and whooping cough and ague. My wife died when she was 33 years old from complications of birthing her last child. She had been pregnant 9 times, 3 miscarriages, 6 babies, 4 dead before 5. 2 children survived into adulthood. Martha, who survived me, and my younger daughter Maria, who died while I was serving my first term as president. And when I came to edit the New Testament, I cheerfully took out the miracles. No walking on water, no water into wine. That didn't cost me a moment's sleep. And I took out the healings. But I must say that the heart overwhelmed me, and I left in my Bible, the Jefferson Bible, 2 healings of children, because I simply could not face the prospect that we live in a world where, if there is a God, if there is goodness and providence, the innocent, the children, are not healed by some miraculous agency or other. So this was a lapse of reason, but I think you will accept it as an effusion of the heart. Sir? On immigration? Well, we have a natural right to vote with our feet and leave the country in which we are accidentally born and enter any other country on earth. The right to emigration is a fundamental right, and if there is a right to emigration, of course there must be a right to immigration under certain conditions. I hoped we would people ourselves from within from Anglo stock, but I knew that under natural law we had no choice but to let anyone come, and after a very short probationary period, enjoy all of the fruits of American life. Just as if I wish to go live in Canada or Mexico or Ireland, I have a natural right to vote with my feet. Yes?
Why did Lewis commit suicide?
Why did Mr. Lewis commit suicide? Well, we don't know. Why does anyone commit suicide? It's impossible to determine in the end. And he didn't leave anything like a suicide note. But here's my own theory. Mr. Lewis had a drinking problem, and a very severe one. He was also from birth a hypochondriac, a kind of melancholy man. You would say manic depressive. I noticed some of this when he was serving with me in the White House. I thought that his tour of the West would either cure him of that hypochondria or it would put it aside, at least for that journey. And it did, I think. But when he came back and I dispatched him to St. Louis to be the first governor there, he began to drink heavily again, and then he became an opium addict, and he had trouble. He proposed to a number of women, all of whom turned him down. He was personally bankrupt. His finances as a public official were being challenged by Mr. Madison's War Department. And most important, even though I wrote to him about once a month saying, when can we expect your account of your famous trip to the American West? Mr. Lewis never wrote a single line. And so I think a whole series of things accumulated during those last 3 years to bring him to his death. Over in this flank over here, there are several questions. Yes? Go ahead. Someone.
How old were you when you died?
I was 83 years old. Is there another question there? Yes, go ahead. Okay. This is a Latin proverb from Ovid, the great Latin poet. Omnia mutantur, omnia fluent, quod erimus aut sumus cros non erimus. All things change, all things flow. What was yesterday and what is today, tomorrow will not be. Did I have any brothers and sisters? Yes, I had 8 sisters and 1 brother. I was the eldest male child. Yes, sir, in the back here. On hemp? Sir, I grew hemp, but I never ingested it, nor would any rational being. The principle of life is clarity, is lucidity, is reason. I was never intoxicated in the whole course of my life, although I drank 2 or 3 glasses of wine every day of my adulthood. I said I cannot live without wine. But the idea that a man of the Enlightenment would voluntarily incapacitate his reason, this is madness. Sir?
Since the issue has recently arisen, you were provided with public resources from a friend. How much did you charge Lewis for his?
The question is, how much did I charge Meriwether Lewis to live in the White House? And I take the point of your satire, but it misses the mark in my case. Mr. Lewis was an employee of the President of the United States. He was paid the pitiful sum of $500 per annum. I offered him digs in the White House because it seemed to me that he should be close by, and he served this country with extraordinary heroism and patriotism, and the thought that anyone could link that to the whoring of the White House in your time disgusts me. Yes, here.
What do you think about our President Bill Clinton?
Well, I think I may have just answered that question, but what do I think of your current president? Well, let me make a brief answer. Any person who has wanted to be the President of the United States since he was 16 years old and will admit it publicly is a dangerous man who should be denied that office. I'm quite serious. I said in my first term, whenever a man casts his eye longingly on public office, a certain rottenness of character is sure to creep in. Yes, sir. What are my views of other presidents? Oh, my views, well, how are my views different from those of other presidents? Well, George Washington was a very great man, but he really he defined the presidency as a kind of halfway house towards monarchy. Not because he was corrupt. He was not corrupt. He was a very great Republican. But he didn't know. No one had ever made a president before, and he felt that if there weren't kind of a majesty to the office, some aloofness from the people, that the president would never have the kind of authority we need to hold a society together. Now, I simply disagree with that absolutely. I shook hands with people. I dressed casually as the President of the United States. I abolished protocol during my administration. I behaved as president like a scientist, farmer, first citizen. George Washington had a rather different view. He wouldn't even touch the American people. He bowed stiffly to them. I disagree with that, but I don't blame him for that. John Adams was even worse, if you can imagine that John Adams wanted titles of nobility for our national officers. He wanted George Washington to be called His Majesty, the Savior of American liberties, as his official title. Well, James Madison put an end to that in the debates of Congress, and then because John Adams wanted a title so desperately, the wits of Congress gave him one. And for the rest of his life, John Adams was known as His Rotundity. I was a casual president. Anyone who wanted could write me a letter and I would respond. I made no progress. I never went touring as president. I just minded my business as the chief administrator of the country in the White House. James Madison was my hand-picked successor, and James Monroe was my hand-picked second successor, so they continued my policy. And then John Quincy Adams was president, and he was a little bit more prickly, like his father. So my style, my presidency is distinguished for two things. The style that I brought, which was really the invitation to social democracy rather than monarchy. For example, I didn't take State of the Union messages personally to Congress. I simply sent them by messenger to Congress. I always took the more simple, the more unpretentious line. And secondly, I let Congress take the lead. I fought one small war during my first term, and I refused to do anything unilateral. I always made Congress, the people's branch of government, take the lead in all questions of war and money. Yes, over here, sir.
Perspective on what the Constitution of the United States currently appears like in relationship to your time.
What is your Constitution compared to what it was in my time? Well, I can answer this question in several brief ways. First of all, I'm sorry you even have our Constitution in your time. I believe very strongly that the earth belongs to the living and not to the dead. And I said to Mr. Madison, if you accept this principle of natural law, the Constitution of the United States should be torn up every 19 years. So the fact that you are still clinging to a kind of semi-sacred document, the Constitution of the United States, that was written in my time when there were 6 million of us and 97% were farmers, when a high-tech weapon was a musket that took 2.5 minutes to reload, when it took 6 weeks for a ship to cross to London, in a 3-mile-per-hour world, to think that in that world where we created a Newtonian constitution for a leisurely paced agricultural society, and then somehow you would cling to that constitution and impose it on 266 million people who live in an advanced industrial world. This is ludicrous. You should have torn it up from time to time and started fresh. And the way you have avoided doing that is to make it what Mr. Hamilton calls a living document. In other words, implied powers. And once you have broad construction of the Constitution and implied powers, you may as well write the Constitution on wax. The whole security is in having a social contract that we all agree to. If you're going to have jurists and legislators and executives who begin to twist that into new opportunities and new dilemmas without consulting the people, then you have lost the security of a written Constitution. So my solution would be tear up your Constitution and start fresh. And certainly do not look upon constitutions like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. Yes?
You're saying to write another constitution. Who has the moral dignity and statue of you or anyone in your time now that can write a constitution like that?
The question is, who in your time has the moral dignity and intellectual stature and political good sense to write a new constitution for your time and place? And there's a kind of implied praise of my own generation and of me. And I must say, sir, you should be ashamed of yourself for letting that sentence come out of your mouth, because it means that you somehow think there was a golden age of virtue. By thinking that, you make two terrible mistakes. First, we were not a golden age of virtue. We were men like other men. We had strengths and weaknesses. We had pettiness. We were selfish sometimes. This was not an age of demigods. This was an age of human beings. And secondly, by aggrandizing us and placing us as a kind of pantheon of secular saints, you effectively disable yourself from taking the urgent responsibilities that are required to build a just society in your own time. I would trust randomly selected every fifth person from this audience to sit down for 6 weeks and produce a better Constitution than James Madison's without a single day of preparation. Yes?
What do you feel the most important lesson you've ever learned is?
This is a great question. I've never been asked it before. What is the most important lesson that I ever learned? Well, there are several. I made my own 10 commandments, not meaning any irreverence. I said, no man ever regretted having eaten too little. I said, never ask someone else to do what you can do for yourself. I said, take things always by their smooth handle, etc. But let me give you the most important of all of them. Dr. Franklin taught me this one. Franklin said, never contradict another man in public. You won't convince him, and you might wind up in a duel. People are not convinced by argument, so never disagree. And I told my own grandson, my favorite grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, to follow Franklin's advice. And I said this, and I think this is the heart of the answer to your question. I said to him, whenever I hear another man express an opinion which is not mine, I say to myself, he has a right to his opinion, as I do to mine. His error does me no injury. And if you keep that principle in line, your happiness will soar and your conflict will cease. Yes?
Over the years, you had many successes. What would you suggest the group today to also have successes of the height of yours?
the question is, what can I say to you to suggest that you can have a life as successful and accomplished as mine? I thank you for your compliment. It goes back to the very elegant introduction that was offered for me today. And as I stood waiting to be brought on to this stage, I felt embarrassed because one achievement after the next was being listed. And in some sense, it made me feel humbled in the face of all that. I was lucky. I was born a privileged man with slaves at the foundation of my privilege. I was born in a time when men could automatically control the world and women were subordinated to them. I was born at a time when the rich and the well-born, the privileged, the well-educated, automatically rose to the top of the social structure. So I'm a man of extraordinary privilege, and I can never forget that for a single moment. Other people who had to struggle more, like Patrick Henry, for example, could never have the leisure to study Indian languages, to study archaeology, to study paleontology, because they were scrambling to stay alive, and he was richer than most. So that's the easy answer to your question. The more egotistical answer is this. I said to my daughter, Martha, never waste a single moment, ever. He who never wastes a single moment will never complain of a want of time. It is amazing how much we may do if we are always doing. Here's my advice to you in this audience if you are still young. First of all, read 10 to 15 hours per day. I hear a wave of disbelief, but this is the basis of it. I'm not the most intelligent of the founding fathers, but I'm the best read man who ever lived in the United States. And that will make up for a great deal. So read. Perhaps 15 hours is unrealizable in your time. I wonder why that should be, but if it is, take 5, take 4 hours per day and make it your discipline. It's the discipline that matters, not the number of minutes. Secondly, learn languages. You are more interesting in direct proportion to the number of languages that you learn. You should all know Spanish. I said to my daughter, every American should know Spanish because we're going to have so much intercourse with that people in the West. But you should also know Latin and Greek and some other modern language. If you start today, the next time I see you, you will be reading and writing in ancient Greek. I honestly believe you must do this, that a monolingual society is a culturally deprived society. And since you live in the midst of Indian country, I would urge you to learn 1 or 2 Indian languages, at least in part. Make music. In my time, there was no recorded music of any sort. Every piece of music in my whole lifetime was live, was performed by someone. That matters because when we make music, however imperfectly, we are participating in the beauties of the universe. When you listen to music, however perfect it is, you are passive. But if you play a tune on a pianoforte or a cello, you are resonating your own soul with deep natural laws of harmony, and that will improve your character. And also get exercise every day of your life. I walked when I was a young man. I rode my horse as an adult. But I never went a day without some exercise or other because I believe that if the body languishes, the mind is a mere vegetable. So this is a formula. No intoxicants. Get plenty of sleep. Figure out what discipline you can establish for yourself for reading, for music, for languages, for exercise, and whatever that quantity is within the confines of your own existence, adhere to it rigidly every day. And I promise you, you may not have a chance to write a Declaration of Independence. You may not be the ambassador to France, but you can, if you wish, write 22,000 letters, as I did. You can read books, and you can change the world because knowledge is power. You must never forget that knowledge is power. And in your time, when there has been an effective collapse of culture in the United States, every one of you can rise to the top of the cultural elite by labor. The greatest thing you can possibly do if you want to change the world or lead a complete life is to begin today a discipline of reading and languages. That's the most important thing I have to tell you today. I'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Sir. I will in a moment. Yes. Yes, I was sorry that my introducer was rather hostile towards me about my view of women. I don't think my view of women is at all erroneous. I believe women are extraordinary beings. I believe they are equal to men in every fundamental way. I greatly improved women's access to inheritance by abolishing primogeniture and entail in Virginia. I improved women's access to the courts, and I believe that women should be educated, if only because they will be educating their children. My daughter Martha was arguably the best educated woman in the world. I love the company of women. But I will say this, the tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion. Much better that you smooth the feathers of your husbands, returning ruffled from political debate. I said, our American angels mistake themselves much if they wish to pursue the French Amazons into the public arena. No. Your happiness, if you only know to recognize it, resides in the nursery. I said, the Creator would have been a pitiful bungler had he designed men and women so different physically and not intended different social and moral functions. And in 1807, when Albert Gallatin, my gifted but foreign-born Secretary of the Treasury, wrote to me and said, Mr. Jefferson, women hold office in Paris, and there has been no collapse of French society, I said, this, sir, is a proposition that the American people are not prepared for, nor am I. Yes?
How much sleep did you get per night?
How much sleep did I get per night? I got 6 or 7 hours of sleep per night. Sleep is not an issue. You should sleep as many hours as you need or want to. It's what you do with your waking hours that will make the difference in the world. Yes? Go ahead. That's very good. I'll close with this question about my inventions, then I will break character and we will talk further for another 15 minutes. But this was a question about my life as an inventor, and it's a good place to close, I think. I was not a serious inventor. I would call myself a gadgeteer. I only had one invention of any true value, and that was my moldboard plow of least resistance. I was in Europe. I saw a peasant plowing with an inefficient plow. I took a tablet out of my pocket and designed a plow of least resistance. All of you who have any agricultural background know that the purpose of a plow is to lift the earth and then to turn it. And the angle of those two operations is the genius of a plow. And I designed from Newton's calculus, his fluxions, a moldboard style of least resistance, least erosion. I had that plow built in the United States, and it reduced the labor of plowing by about 35%. Now that, I think, is an invention. I didn't patent it. I don't believe in patents. I believe that when an idea is discovered, it is truly uncovered and belongs to humanity. Jonathan Swift said, he who makes 2 blades of grass grow where one did previously has done more good than all of the statesmen who ever lived. As the first officer of patents in the United States, because I was Secretary of State, I was very reluctant to grant patents, only 37 during my tenure. I tested each one for its uniqueness. And in turning down one patent, I said to a man named McPherson, he who takes an idea from me informs himself without disinforming me. He who takes an idea from me informs himself without disinforming me, just as he who lights his torch from my candle illuminates himself without darkening me. Do you see why ideas belong to humanity? Because it's not a finite quantity. An idea can be spread like gold or fire across the entire planet. My other inventions at Monticello are rather more idiosyncratic. I had a wine dumbwaiter next to the fireplace so that wine could be brought up from the cellar. I had special secret stairways and secret passages and skylights and so on. I had a weather vane that could be looked at from inside or outside the house, etc. You see, these are hardly earth-shattering in their importance, but one I will concentrate on for just a moment was my clock. I know some of you have visited Monticello, and I had a great obsession with clocks. I had many of them there at a time when clocks were relatively rare and quite expensive. And I decided to design for the lobby, which was a kind of Indian museum, the first calendar clock in history. The clock itself was a typical mechanism. We had no electrical power at this time, so all clocks were pendulum clocks. or grandfather sorts of clocks. And out of this clock face came chains on either side that went to the corners of the room and over pulleys, and those chains dangled to the floor. Then, to give the chains weightedness, I attached lead cannonballs at intervals. One of the chains was for the chimes, and one of the chains was for the clock mechanism. And I designed a special folding ladder, and every Monday morning climbed it and drew all of those cannonballs back up to the ceiling. And as they were drawn down by Newton's gravity in the course of the week, they made the clock work. So much for the time of day. Now what about the day of the week? Well, my solution to this was to paint one of those cannonballs blue, and then to have placards pasted on the wall that said Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You see the ingenuity of this. You look up at the face of the clock to see the time of the day, and then over at the corner of the room to see the day of the week. Potentially a perfect invention. The problem was that when the cannonball reached the parquet floor, which I had also designed, it was only Friday. And I was sometimes notional and stubborn. So instead of redesigning the clock, I had 4-inch holes bored through the floor. The cannonball then went into the cellar. I painted Saturday and Sunday down there. This produced some disorientation on the weekend, but I think you see the point. Let me close my formal remarks by saying just a word about John Adams. We were friends. Then we quarreled over the French Revolution and the nature of man and the nature of government. And then when we were in our retirement, I at Monticello and he in Massachusetts, we were reconciled by the intervention of our mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Rush believed that we were the North and South Pole of the American Revolution, two of the last signers alive, and that we should reconcile before our deaths. And so he manipulated us by writing to each one of us saying that the other was eager for reconciliation. This had its intended effect, vanity being what it is. And on the first day of January 1812, my friend John Adams, whom I had not seen since 1801, wrote me a letter. And then we exchanged 200 letters in the next 14 years. Some scholars believe that it's the richest correspondence in American history. I obviously leave that to you to determine. But in about his 5th letter, Mr. Adams said to me the finest thing ever said to me. He said, "My friend, we must not die until we have explained ourselves to each other." And we tried. And it was an extraordinary friendship. And then by odd coincidence, we died on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years exactly from the adoption of my Declaration of Independence. I died in Virginia. He died in Massachusetts. I died in my bed at my beloved Monticello, surrounded by my daughter Martha and her children. John Adams died in his cottage in Massachusetts. His wife had predeceased him. He was 91, I was 83. I died first. I died at noon on the 4th of July, 1826. And my last words were, "Is it the 4th?" John Adams died around 5 p.m., several hundred miles to the north. And his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He was wrong, as always. But exactly 10 days before this, I wrote the last of my letters. I wrote 22,000 letters in the course of my life. And the last of them was not to Adams, but to the organizer of a Jubilee celebration in Washington City, a city that I had helped to survey, a city that I had been the first president to be inaugurated in. But I couldn't go, obviously. I was dying of urinary infection and a prostate cancer. And so I sent the last of my letters, and I really want to close with a portion of it, and I would like you to carry this idea with you into the next century, and indeed into the next millennium, because if my life means anything, all of those achievements that were listed, If my life means anything at all, it means that I stood for liberty, and that principle of liberty is as fundamental as anything in life. And this is what I said. All eyes are open or opening to the rights of man. The gradual spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of men were not born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Let that be the ground of hope for others. Thank you.